It's amazing to think, those clunky computers from the 80s, those beige boxes, have evolved into these sleek devices we're practically glued to.
Yeah.
Information technology has really, completely reshaped our lives. It's woven into how we connect with family, how students are learning these days, how we work. It's the backbone of society itself.
Huh.
The 80s, that's when things really started to change. Suddenly, anyone could have a computer at home, access information. It was a huge power shift.
Absolutely. And because IT has become so essential, this whole area of IT ethics has emerged. It's become crucial. So that's what we're diving into today on the deep dive with this really fascinating material you've shared. It's like a deep dive into how IT is shaping the world and the ethical compass guiding this whole transformation.
Okay, so let's break it down. Our first module is IT and society. We'll be tracking the big IT developments, the milestones over the past, 50 years, and we'll really try to understand their impact on society. We'll also be exploring this concept of digital citizenship. What does it actually mean to live in this information age? And we'll look at it from different perspectives: communities, genders, age groups, cultural backgrounds. Oh, and we can't forget the planet. We've got to consider the environmental impact of all this tech we're using.
Right. And then in Module 2, we shift gears to management information systems and all the legal and ethical stuff within IT itself, like who's responsible when things go wrong, how are laws shaping the field, the role of ethical guidelines, professional conduct, and then we'll take a peek into the future, what tech developments might be coming and what risks might come along with them.
Yeah, exactly. So with this deep dive, we really want to give everyone listening a clear, an insightful look at these key issues, and we'll uncover some surprising facts, some aha moments, without getting too bogged down in technical jargon. The goal is to walk away with a solid grasp of how IT and our lives are constantly, intertwined in this ever-evolving dance.
Right.
Let's jump in. When we think about the impact of ICT on our lives, the material you've shared points out that the first computers that really resembled our modern systems, those appeared back in the 1970s.
Right. But those were pretty exclusive back then. Mostly big organizations and those hardcore tech enthusiasts were using them. But then the 80s arrived and boom, personal computers become affordable.
Yeah.
I remember when my family got our first computer, it felt like, I don't know, like something out of Star Trek. We were doing basic things on it, maybe some word processing, but definitely some pretty basic games too.
Yeah.
But for anyone who remembers those days, it was a game changer.
It really was. The 80s, that's when ICT started to become part of everyday life. The material highlights how family life, education, work, society in general, everything became more and more dependent on these technologies. And it's not just the hardware, it's the software applications that have become essential for so many things we do daily. Right. It's almost impossible to imagine life without it now. But there's a key distinction. Your sources make the impact of technology in general versus the specific role of computers in our lives today.
Exactly. While technology has always been shaping society, computers brought something new to the table. They could process information and digitize content, and that's had a huge impact. It's amplified the impact of technology in ways we couldn't have predicted.
So we've seen this massive integration of IT. Now, the source introduces this idea of digital citizenship. Okay, let's unpack that. What does that even mean, in today's world for you and me, just trying to navigate this digital space?
So digital citizenship, the material defines it as, the norms, the beliefs, and values that go along with using computers. It's about how we behave when we're using computer technology. Essentially, it's about taking our real-world ethics and applying them online, recognizing that what we do digitally, it has consequences.
And it's not really an option to just opt out anymore, is it? The source uses examples like who even files their taxes by mail these days. And it's harder and harder to avoid social media completely.
Exactly. The material highlights that in today's world, it's practically impossible to be completely detached from technology. We're constantly required to do things that are either completely or partially dependent on computers. And so that requires a certain set of characteristics, a way to behave responsibly in the digital world.
So what does it mean to be a good digital citizen? What are the key things to keep in mind?
Okay, the sources break it down into a few key areas. First, digital citizenship requires access to digital technology. To be part of society today, you need to have an electronic presence. You need to be able to access social networks, e-government services, and just be part of that exchange of information digitally.
That makes sense. You can't be a citizen if you can't even enter the town square, even if that town square is online. What else is there?
Another element is engaging in electronic commerce. Being able to buy and sell online, accessing all the products and services available on the internet. I mean, some things like entertainment, electronics, travel, they're almost exclusively online now.
Right. And the way we connect with each other, that's fundamentally shifted too.
Exactly. Digitized communication methods, that's a huge part of it. Text messages, instant messaging, video conferencing, VoIP. Being a digital citizen means having access to these services, having the devices like webcams and tablets, and being able to use them effectively. And that leads to, a new kind of literacy. The material points out that you can be highly educated but still technologically illiterate. So training and education, that's crucial.
It's not enough to have the tools. You have to know how to use them properly.
Absolutely. And then there's online protocol and etiquette. Just like in face-to-face interactions, there are rules for how we behave online. Like, remember how using all caps online is considered shouting? Or the idea of asking permission before you start a video call. It's all about knowing those unwritten rules of the road, but for the digital world.
Those unwritten rules of the digital road. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else?
Another big one is being aware of the laws that apply in the digital world. A lot of people don't realize that when we're online, our actions are subject to laws specifically written for the electronic space. We're responsible for what we post, how we interact with others, how we behave when we're buying and selling online. It's about knowing our digital rights and responsibilities. Legislation, like the Data Protection Act, that's the framework that keeps things from being completely chaotic.
It's about knowing the rules of the game, even in this online space.
Precisely. And then there's this area that's often overlooked: digital well-being. The material talks about feelings of withdrawal and isolation that can happen in online communities, the possibility of addiction to the web and online gaming, and just the confusion and even depression that can come from having an online persona that's different from who you are in real life.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the connectivity and forget about the potential downsides.
That's right. And so online safety is a big part of this. There are guidelines and best practices to make sure everyone's protected, especially young people and those who are more vulnerable to negative experiences online.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, security concerns. This is huge, especially when it comes to online purchases, doing things with the government online or online banking, protecting your personal details and financial information from cybercriminals and privacy violations. That's a fundamental part of digital citizenship. And in the UK, the source specifically points to the Data Protection Act of 1998 and its 2018 update, as well as the Freedom of Information Act. These are key legislative frameworks.
It sounds like a lot to keep in mind, but it's all part of navigating this modern tech-filled world we live in. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. The source talks about how the information age has impacted communities. What are some of the big takeaways there?
Well, one fascinating thing is how the internet has become this incredible resource. You have free access to information, software, advice, expert knowledge. It's all right there. And this easy access has made us more reliant on technology, of course. The source mentions globalization. It's a combination of global and local, and it describes how the internet allows us to connect with people all over the world, but it also allows for these really localized communities to form online.
So you could connect with someone who shares your passion for, I don't know, collecting antique thimbles, even if they live on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, exactly. And social media is a huge part of this. It's broken down geographical and time barriers. It's allowed these virtual communities to spring up around shared interests.
Right.
And there are a lot of benefits to that. Meeting new people, reconnecting with old friends, interacting with people from different backgrounds, finding support networks, connecting with others who share your passions. But the source does acknowledge a potential downside for some people. It might lead to less face-to-face interaction if it's easier to communicate online.
It's all about balance, right?
Yeah.
The virtual world offers so much, but we can't lose sight of those real-world connections. The source also brings up something really relatable, using the web for everyday things like finding information about schools, store locations, community events, local government services. It's almost like we don't even think about it anymore, do we?
Right, it's second nature. And that just shows how efficient it is to find information online. Why bother searching through phone books or waiting on hold when you can probably find the answer in seconds online?
Okay, let's talk about gender. The source highlights some really important points about gender and IT.
Right. It starts by acknowledging the gender inequalities that still exist in a lot of societies. Then it delves into the history of misconceptions and prejudices against women in computer science, which is actually pretty ironic when you consider that initially mainframe programming was dominated by women.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. It
Yeah.
challenges the stereotype completely.
It does. And the material emphasizes that access to IT for different genders, it's not just a personal choice. It's heavily influenced by sociocultural factors and even corporate culture.
Mm.
It outlines a few key areas of concern when we look at gender in IT. Access to technology, the control over how it's used, effective infrastructure, education, training opportunities, and skills development.
And are there still disparities in these areas?
Unfortunately, yes. The material points out that historically, tech content and even the language used in IT has been very male-oriented, although it's getting better as more women enter the field. It also raises the issue of how women are disproportionately affected by misuse of the internet, things like cyberstalking, pornography, trafficking, online harassment, and censorship.
Ugh, yeah.
And then there are things like cost, time constraints, which are often due to family responsibilities and limitations on mobility. These things can really make it harder for women to access IT on an equal footing. Think about discrimination in training investments or simply not having enough time for education because of other commitments.
Yeah, these are really crucial issues that need constant attention.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's move on to age. It's no secret that technology can sometimes feel like it belongs to the younger generation.
Right. The source acknowledges the common complaints from older generations about struggling with technology. And while the gap between generations has definitely shrunk, it emphasizes that a divide still exists because technology keeps evolving so rapidly.
Right.
The material also presents some interesting findings about senior citizens online. More and more seniors are using the internet, and broadband adoption is on the rise, mainly for browsing. But internet use is linked to income. There is a significant drop-off after age 75, and higher education is linked to more internet use.
So what's driving this increased adoption among older adults? For our listeners who might be helping an older relative navigate all this tech, what motivates them?
Well, a few things. Technology is just easier to use now. Interfaces are simpler, the cost of going online is more affordable, older people are increasingly able to use technology, training is more available, and the internet offers entertainment and access to vital medical information.
Mm-hmm.
But the source does point out that physical limitations can still be a barrier, and things like affluence and education still play a role in whether older adults use the internet. And it's important to remember that older users are not all the same. Their behavior and how they adapt to IT, it varies a lot.
Of course, of course. And what are some of the obstacles that older adults specifically face when they're trying to adopt new technologies?
The material highlights a few key obstacles. Some older adults just don't see the benefits of technology, or they have a hard time adapting to new tools. They might feel like they can't learn new things, and the learning curve with technology can be really steep. There's also a preference for owning devices rather than sharing, and challenges with things like touchscreens and input devices. Sometimes it's just the physical size of a computer that's a problem, and then there's the perception that social networks are too complicated.
These are all really important considerations. It highlights the need for well-designed technology and support systems that cater to a diverse range of users. Now, let's think about culture. How does culture play a role in all of this?
The source explains that things like local economies, regional perceptions, and even national culture can have a big impact on how new technologies are adopted and how they enter a society. Local trends can influence how people view technology, how much support the government provides for infrastructure, and the kind of educational frameworks that are in place. If a society doesn't have a positive view of technology, it's likely there won't be enough support for it to be adopted widely.
Right.
And there's this concept called uncertainty avoidance, which means that cultures that are less comfortable with uncertain situations might resist new technologies.
That makes sense. A culture that really values stability and tradition might be hesitant to adopt things that are constantly changing.
Right, so we've talked about the impact of IT on individuals and different social groups. Now, let's zoom out and consider the environment. That affects all of us no matter who we are.
This is such a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in the convenience and the benefits of technology, but we have to think about the cost to the planet.
Exactly. The source stresses the need to be aware of our resource use, to think about economies of scale, and to adopt sustainable consumption patterns. We need to break this cycle of technology becoming obsolete and ending up as waste. The pace of technological development is so fast that we're often overproducing and replacing devices, smartphones, tablets, way too quickly.
It's the constant pressure to upgrade, to have the newest gadget.
Yeah. And while recycling programs were initially about ethical disposal, the source points out that it's shifted towards a more profitable practice of exporting used devices to developing countries. which, it does extend the life of some devices, but it can have complicated impacts on those markets. And we can't forget that producing new technology, that means we're constantly generating toxic materials and chemical byproducts. And often those are manufactured in developing countries with weaker environmental regulations. So we end up with pollution and health risks for the workers and people living nearby.
So the environmental cost is often pushed onto someone else.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. The source also talks about the energy consumption associated with IT. And it's not just about running the devices, it's also about the energy it takes to manufacture them, which is surprisingly high.
Yeah.
It mentions the EU energy classification system for devices and makes an interesting comparison. Cars, they use most of their energy in operation. But computers, they require a much larger percentage of their energy footprint in manufacturing, something like 60% for manufacturing versus 40% for operation. So it really makes you think twice about whether upgrading every year is really worth it.
It definitely does. Okay, so how does IT impact the environment? Can we break it down?
Sure. The source categorizes the impact in 3 ways. The technology itself, like using greener, biodegradable components in manufacturing, how the technology is applied, like using video conferencing to reduce travel, and our behavior as users, like choosing cloud storage over physical hard drives. And it also points out that technology can be an enabler for greener practices. It can help optimize manufacturing, substitute physical products with virtual ones, lead to things like digital photos, reducing paper use, and improve recyclability.
So IT can be part of the problem, but also part of the solution.
Right. Now, the source also looks at how the information age impacts different social groups. It points out that environmental concerns are a big issue for many groups, and these groups are often defined by their consumption ability, their level of education, and their financial status. The impact of readily available information can vary too, with some communities relying more heavily on technology and access to information than others. And social media, well, that's had a huge impact on the information we produce and how much information we think we need. Just think about all the photos, tweets, and messages flying around constantly.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with information.
It is, and businesses are really feeling the effects of all the data generated through social networks. It's impacting how they operate and how they handle information. The source points out trends like people being active on multiple social networks at the same time, social media becoming a tool for business networking, people accessing information primarily through mobile devices, the information that's available influencing decisions like hiring, professional networks helping with collaboration, and the fact that there's generally less trust online compared to in real life.
Right.
Plus, more and more organizations are using social media for marketing and customer communication.
So it's not just changing how we connect as individuals, it's fundamentally reshaping how businesses function.
Exactly. And this brings us to the question of how IT-induced changes affect individuals in their personal lives, in their work, their education, and how they buy and sell things.
Let's talk about everyday life. How has technology changed our homes? I mean, for a lot of us, our homes are basically interconnected tech hubs.
Right. Computers are everywhere in our homes. We use the internet to access information instantly. We shop online for everything from groceries to electronics. We have home cinemas and smart devices for entertainment. The internet has replaced encyclopedias as our go-to source of information. We store our memories digitally, we pay bills online, and more government services are accessible online, from taxes to healthcare records.
What about schools? How has technology changed education?
Education has been completely revolutionized. The World Wide Web gives us access to an incredible amount of information.
Yeah.
There are sophisticated learning tools that cater to different learning styles and abilities, and the entire structure of education has changed with the rise of virtual learning environments, or VLEs.
Right, yeah.
These are online platforms where students can learn. The source describes their functions. They have repositories of content, discussion boards, online assessments, and communication tools. VLEs facilitate collaborative learning, they offer instructor support, and they allow for blended learning, a mix of face-to-face interaction and online automation.
It's not just about replacing textbooks with websites. It's about changing the whole experience of learning.
Exactly. And last but not least, the workplace. How has IT and the internet changed the way we work?
Well, the changes have been huge. The material highlights the fact that we're now able to handle more complex tasks, our individual performance is increased, decision-making is more data-driven, and there are all these workflow and supply chain management systems in place. Technologies for communication and collaboration, things like online meetings and email, those are standard now. And then there are tools like computer-supported cooperative work and groupware, which allow teams to work together remotely. Business travel has been reduced, and automation has led to certain job types being displaced.
Right, right. So from home to school to the workplace, IT has become a constant and really transformative force. And that leads us to Module 2, where we're going to focus on management information systems and specifically the legal and ethical issues that have emerged because IT is so deeply embedded in society.
Okay, we've seen how IT has changed everything. So let's get into the rules of the game, the legal and ethical stuff within management information systems. The material starts by saying that even political and legal aspects of daily life, those affect IT. And liability in IT support, services and projects, that's a really big deal, right? Because ultimately, the purpose of law is to hold people accountable for their actions, and that's especially important when we're talking about things like sensitive data and how we use technology.
It is. Both existing laws and future legislation, those have a big impact on how we use, design, develop, and deploy IT, especially in today's globalized world. The source points out that anyone working in IT could potentially face legal action for a variety of reasons, usually for breaking contracts or not meeting expectations in areas like development, sales, licensing, support, even just giving advice.
That sounds like a lot of potential for liability. What kinds of roles are most vulnerable?
The source lists a few roles that are commonly associated with needing IT liability insurance. Software developers, hardware manufacturers, network solution providers, telecommunications providers, ISPs, IT consultants, resellers, and technicians. But it's important to understand what that insurance usually doesn't cover. Things like poor quality work, product recalls, repairs, and any liability for injury, harm, or damage that's outlined in a contract.
So it's not a free pass for making mistakes. What sorts of cases are usually covered by this insurance?
Usually the policies cover things like breaches of duty, breaches of confidentiality, errors, things that were left out, allegations of negligence, unintentional defamation, dishonest or fraudulent actions, loss or damage of information or equipment, and infringement of intellectual property like patents, trademarks, and copyrights.
Okay, so it's focused on specific mistakes that could lead to legal action. The source also mentions something called a corporate credo and how organizations use that to manage IT responsibility. What is that exactly?
A corporate credo is basically an organization's policy that's meant to ensure that employees are behaving appropriately when it comes to IT. That could mean things like developing software that's high quality, protecting sensitive data, making sure there's no fraud, and using company equipment legally. The source really emphasizes how important it is for organizations to have IT policies that are well communicated, clear, that everyone's been consulted on, that they're legally sound, consistent, and that they apply to everyone. And that includes educational institutions for both staff and students. These policies cover everything from how equipment is used to software and even the copying of materials.
It's about setting clear boundaries and expectations. But how do organizations make sure these policies are actually effective and that they can be enforced?
Well, the source refers to Cengage Learning and outlines 5 criteria for a policy to be enforceable. First, dissemination. That means making sure the policy is widely known. Second, review, making it accessible in different formats. Third, comprehension, writing the policy clearly and making sure everyone understands it. Fourth, compliance, requiring some kind of action to show that people agree to the policy. And finally, uniform enforcement, making sure the policy is applied consistently across the organization.
Those seem like really important steps to make sure a policy actually works. It's interesting that the source mentions how IT legal issues are becoming more and more important, even pointing out specialized programs that focus on this area.
Yeah, it's significant that places like the Global Institute for IT Management are offering certificates in managing IT legal issues. It shows how important this is becoming. The source lists a few of the topics covered in these programs, like enterprise issues in IT law, information assurance in law, legal issues and contract management and IT outsourcing, contract mediation, arbitration, intellectual property, and issues and trends in IT law.
Let's dig a little deeper into intellectual property. The source talks about copyright, trademarks, and domain names as key areas.
Okay, so with copyright, the source explains that you automatically have protection for your original work, whether it's written, musical, artistic, whatever, as soon as you create it. It also mentions fair use, which means you can use a limited amount of copyrighted material for certain purposes, like excerpts, as long as you cite the source properly.
Hmm.
Trademarks are a bit different. Those are words, symbols, or names that are used for branding, and companies will register them to get legal protection. And domain names, those are the website addresses, and those have become a big area of legal battles. You see disputes over similar names, people registering domain names just to extort money later, or even replicating entire websites using a similar domain name.
It sounds like the online world has created a whole new set of challenges for intellectual property law. The source also talks about legal issues with email marketing, specifically the problem of spam.
Yeah, because it's so easy to reach a lot of people through email, we've seen this huge increase in unsolicited spam, which is not only a waste of time and resources, but also a way for cyber criminals to operate. The source lists a few common types of cybercrime, like spoofing, which is disguising the sender's address in an email, phishing, which is tricking people into revealing sensitive information, identity theft, stealing personal information, cyberstalking, which is basically harassment online, cookie poisoning, which is manipulating cookies on websites, spyware, which is software that secretly monitors your computer use, and malware attacks, where harmful software is introduced onto your computer.
That's a pretty scary list. The source also talks about different types of law, civil versus criminal, and private versus public. How do those apply to IT?
It's an important distinction. Civil law that deals with relationships between individuals and organizations. Criminal law is about actions that are harmful to society as a whole, and that's enforced by the state. Private law focuses on relationships between individuals and organizations, while public law is about the relationship between the government and other entities. So, examples of private law would be things like family law, commercial law, labor law, and public law would include things like criminal law, administrative law, and constitutional law. All of these different categories can apply to various IT-related issues, from disputes over contracts to prosecuting cybercrime.
It's a complex web of laws. The source also mentions a few specific pieces of IT legislation.
Right. It references some IT legislation guides from the University of Bristol and E&T magazine, and it lists a bunch of acts that are relevant to the UK and Europe. That includes the Data Protection Act, both the 1998 and 2018 versions, accounting and security standards like IAS 39 and PCI DSS, regulations like SOX and the anti-money laundering rules, environmental directives like the WE directive, healthcare legislation like HIPAA, energy efficiency schemes, advertising codes, and frameworks for managing IT services and skills like SFIA and ITIL. And then there's the importance of having acceptable usage policies for IT.
Wow, that's a lot. Are there any specific acts that the source goes into more detail about?
Yes, it specifically explains the Computer Misuse Act of 1990, which is all about dealing with unauthorized access to computer materials and how those materials are used. Then there's the Copyright, Design, and Patents Act of 1988, which protects different types of creative work. The source stresses the need to get permission before you transmit, copy, or store any copyrighted material unless you have something called a CLA, which is a license. It also talks about the Official Secrets Acts from 1911 to 1989, which protects sensitive government information. The Defamation Act of 1996, that's about the spread of defamatory materials online, so that's relevant to things like emails and social media posts. And then there are acts that deal with obscenity, like the Obscene Publications Act and the Protection of Children Act. Those highlight the fact that it's not okay to publish or allow access to pornographic or violent material on company equipment. Finally, there's the Equality Act of 2010, which is a big one because it merged over 116 pieces of legislation into one act to protect individual rights and promote equality.
It sounds like current legislation provides a framework, but also sets limits for IT professionals. The source uses the Computer Misuse Act and the Data Protection Act as examples.
Right. The Computer Misuse Act defines legal activities really clearly. Things like accessing computer systems without permission, using a computer with the intent to commit a crime, and altering data without authorization. And the Data Protection Act, both the 1998 and 2018 versions, lays out the principles for processing personal data fairly and lawfully. That includes things like limiting the purpose for which data is used, minimizing the amount of data that's collected, ensuring the accuracy of the data, setting rules for data retention, respecting the rights of individuals whose data is being processed, ensuring data security, and being accountable for how data is handled. The 2018 version of the Act further emphasizes the importance of fairness, transparency, and accountability.
And how does all of this legislation affect how IT systems are developed?
The source points out that legislation impacts systems development in a few ways. Software licensing agreements have to comply with the law. Website content needs to follow the Data Protection Act and respect intellectual property rights. And e-commerce websites and apps have to comply with regulations like the Consumer Credit Act and the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, plus all the general consumer protection laws. Developers also have specific obligations, like making sure they're not sending spam in their email marketing campaigns, including disclaimers in their emails, providing legal information in website footers, and being upfront about any mechanisms they use to monitor website traffic, like cookies.
Sounds like there's a lot for IT professionals to keep in mind. Okay, let's move away from the legal stuff and into ethics. The source talks about how important it is for IT professionals to think about the impact of their actions on others.
Absolutely. IT professionals have a lot of power, and with that power comes a huge ethical responsibility. The source emphasizes the need for education in computer ethics and the adoption of codes of ethics to guide behavior. It highlights the ACM Code of Ethics as a prominent example, and this code outlines some general moral imperatives like contributing to well-being, avoiding harm, being honest and fair, honoring property rights, giving credit where it's due, respecting privacy and confidentiality.
Right.
It also outlines more specific professional responsibilities like striving for the highest quality work, maintaining competence, respecting laws, being open to professional review, doing thorough evaluations, honoring contracts, helping the public understand technology, and only accessing systems when authorized.
It's really comprehensive.
It is.
Yeah.
And then it talks about obligations for organizational leaders, like articulating their social responsibilities, managing for quality of work life, making sure resources are used appropriately, ensuring that user needs are met, protecting user dignity, and creating opportunities for learning.
It sounds like they've really thought of everything.
They have. And of course, the code emphasizes the importance of compliance and how violations are taken very seriously.
It's interesting that an international organization like ACM has such a detailed code of ethics. Why is that so important for professionals who are managing IT globally?
Well, the source explains that because ACM has members all over the world, it's important to have a detailed code of conduct to address potential differences that might arise from personality or national culture, especially when you're dealing with sensitive areas like the use of private data. The code is there to educate members about their responsibilities and promote ethical behavior. It also emphasizes that leaders have a responsibility to create policies and make sure everyone follows them. And it stresses that violations are taken very seriously.
The source also mentions the Computer Ethics Institute and their 10 Commandments. Those sound like pretty fundamental guidelines.
They are. They really focus on avoiding harm and respecting digital property. They cover things like not using computers to harm people or interfere with their work, not snooping through files or stealing, not lying, respecting software copyrights, not using resources without permission, not taking credit for someone else's intellectual output, thinking about the social consequences of the programs you write or the systems you design, and always using computers in a way that shows consideration and respect for others.
So they're like the basic principles of ethical conduct that should underpin everything you do with computers. Now, the source touches on the ethical challenges of handling personal data in a global IT context.
This is a big one. Because laws vary so much from country to country, it's a major ethical concern. The source talks about the importance of the Data Protection Act and setting guidelines for handling sensitive information, especially for e-commerce sites, which often handle personal data. It also mentions similar principles that are used across the EU to govern personal data. Use principles like fairness, specificity, restriction, accuracy, destruction, security, and lawful processing.
And how do those compare to data?